My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
All right, folks, welcome back to another home team episode of Diplomatic Immunity. Today, Tristan and I will get into the nitty-gritty of President Trump's Board of Peace, which he announced at Davos in Switzerland last week. And we're going to get into that pretty heavily and what that all means. But anyways, Tristan, good to see you again. It's been 12 days or so. How are you doing?
I'm really well. It is, look, the weather here is not the weather that you're having. So I guess I'm especially well and warm and not having to dig myself out. That is weather that I do not miss from home.
Yeah, and nor are we've got bigger problems globally if you get this snowstorm in Hong Kong. Yeah, we got hit pretty hard. Done a lot of shoveling the last couple of days. Been dealing with rugrats at home, no school, all that kind of stuff. But I am headed to sunny Florida tomorrow morning, so I will get out of this. It's supposed to be like under 32 degrees here for the next week. So we picked a good time to head out for a long weekend. So heading to Florida tomorrow, get out of here. But yeah, things have been nonstop in the foreign policy world. There's so many things we could talk about. But we're going to focus today on Davos and this new Board of Peace. And I think it's interesting because ever since Trump came to office the first time, there has been a lot of talk of, is Davos even worth it anymore? Is it irrelevant now because of this populist surge all across the sort of Western world that has occurred over the past decade or so? And Davos, the World Economic Forum, is like, code for globalization and all those sorts of boogeyman sort of words to the populist side of things. But Davos came back with a roar a couple of weeks ago, not necessarily because of what they were doing at Davos or because everybody is a globalist anymore, but because of the Greenland issue that we talked about on the last podcast, but also this new Board of Peace. So, so what is it?
It was originally going way back into the recesses of history, namely last September. It was originally part of the American president's 20-point plan for Gaza. This was of how he intends to end the war and maintain peace in the Gaza Strip. Now, the United Nations Security Council, it did ratify this Board of Peace as having an oversight role with respect to Gaza, but it's important, and we're going to get into this later, I'm sure. The UN Security Council's endorsement was limited to Gaza and Gaza alone, but as we
it seems to have gotten a little broader than that,
just a bit, and again, we'll certainly get into that. So, it has expanded considerably. The full terms, which were leaked by the Times of Israel, seem to give this thing a global remit, which raises the question, which I'm cannot wait to hear your thoughts on, is whether or not this is a rival, a challenge, Trump's answer to supplant the UN. Now, with the launch of the Board of Peace at Davos, there were 19 countries represented. Notably, although he is a member of it, the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, was absent. The reason he was absent is because there is an international...
Why wasn't he there?
An international arrest warrant against him, treaty bound to arrest him. So he wasn't there. And this is illustrative of a point which I'm, again, sure we're going to speak about, which is that, look, it's a real motley crew who make up this board. And just one other thing that I want to flag before I'm going to throw it over to you is the cost of anteing up to be part of this board. You gotta ante up $1 billion for permanent membership. There is a free membership tier. It's kind of like a streaming service. 2-year membership is free, but you are your inclusion is at the whim of the chairman and the chairman alone. And of course, the chairman is the American president, Donald Trump. So lots there. The cost of attendance. Who has been invited? Who has shown up? Its remit. Where should we start?
Yeah, so I got to say, I think your streaming service metaphor was a little kinder than what I was thinking. But I was thinking a little bit more of, your first taste is free, and then you've got to, pony up the money after that. But yeah, I mean, it's no, it's not a coincidence, right? I mean, Donald Trump has, and the Republicans going back decades to some extent have long criticized the UN, but this administration in particular has been especially, out in front criticizing the United Nations, international organizations writ large, sort of, sovereignty issues, and just kind of like, that mindset of, nobody's going to tell us what we can do. We're going to do that, whatever we want. And again, there's been a strong sense of that in the Republican Party for a while now. I just go back to Iraq War in 2003. But it's also, just recently, the Trump administration has removed itself from over 60 different bodies within the UN. So they're decoupling from the UN at the same time that he's putting forth this board of peace. There's been U.S. personnel have stopped attending the UN. The State Department has stopped coordination on a lot of aspects of that. But this board of peace is, on the surface of it, it's, like you said, it was supposed to be about Gaza. This remit has, according to the document that the Times of Israel released, has a much expanded role. That this is sort of more about resolving conflicts around the globe, not just Gaza. And Donald Trump is the chair for life, and he can choose his own successor. So that's going to get tricky in 2029 on January 20th if Donald Trump is still the chair of that board, and J.D. Vance or some Democrat or Marco Rubio is now president. What is that? That's a little bit of a conflict there.
Yeah, 'cause it's not the American president. It's Donald Trump.
Right. It's Donald Trump. So that's going to be interesting to see how that plays. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how all of this plays out. Obviously, does this thing have legs? Does it not? Is it, an ego-filled move by the president, and we don't hear anything about this 3 months from now because the administration and the president have moved on to the next shiny object? So we'll see. But it's, some of the members make sense. You've got Egypt, Israel, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and some other Muslim states that are obviously involved in this because of the initial remit, which was the outcomes and maintaining peace, or at least a ceasefire in Gaza, and trying to build on that 20-point plan from the fall. But there's also some other folks involved here that are more, Trump-aligned leaders. And that's, Hungary, Argentina, Belarus, not the, what we would highlight as sort of liberal democratic leaders. Some of these folks that are more aligned with President Trump and his administration's idea of what it means to lead and what leadership is. I'd kind of like to hear your thoughts on who hasn't joined, and maybe why, because there are some major great powers that you think of when you think the UN or the UN Security Council, that have not joined.
Well, look, none of the Western Europeans have joined. Italy is going to sit as an observer state, or at least has expressed the desire to sit as an observer. But France, Germany, the United Kingdom have not signed up. The Foreign Secretary, the British Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper, really, said like, well, look, we are studying it in a very diplomatic phrasing, but noted, but to invite the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, to the board of peace, somebody who invaded Ukraine, continues to bomb Ukraine, refuses to meaningfully take steps to work towards peace in that war. And it simply makes no sense. So look, Western Europe, not at the table. Of course, Canada was invited, and then Canada was uninvited in after Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech at Davos, which I'm sure we've all heard. If we haven't, I encourage anybody to go and give it a listen, give it a watch. I've watched it a couple times. I think it was extraordinary. Evidently, it ruffled the feathers of the notoriously thick-skinned American president, who basically threw one of those, well, you're not coming to my birthday party tantrums, and uninvited the Canadian Prime Minister. So the Canadians are not in Beijing, not taking a bite of this, at least yet. And so, you exactly as you point out, you've got this sort of weird, or shall we say, not the typical cast of characters that we would imagine for something like this sat around the table. I mean, you mentioned Argentina. At the launch event itself, Javier Milei had the seat of pride next to Donald Trump at the announcement, which, to me anyway, sends all sorts of signals about what this is really about, what is really valued by the new great dear chairman of the Board of Peace, League of Injustice, whatever it's going to be, called. So, there's a lot of skepticism.
Yeah, it's our next Marvel movie.
It is indeed. There's a lot of skepticism about this by sort of the leading liberal internationalist countries. There's also evidently some skepticism by the likes of, say, China and Beijing, not immediately rushing towards this. I mean, even the Kremlin has said, we're going to study this. So
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right to say, well, maybe we're going to talk about this in a few months' time, in a few years' time, or maybe this will just be, to steal your apt words, yet another shiny object that is part of the Trump reality show of the week. Or maybe this is a story with a few episode arc, but then we move on.
Yeah, and I think it's you mentioned Carney's speech, and I think it's important to highlight that just a little bit more too than we already have, because we've heard rumblings from Western Europe and longstanding U.S. allies over the course of the last decade. You remember the Macron's Europe is, or NATO is brain dead, and Merkel saying stuff about Germany and we have to be on our own now and move out. So we've seen things like that, but I think Carney's speech, coming on the heels of the Greenland episode, the Venezuela episode, the national security strategy, and its focus on the Western Hemisphere, the Donroe Doctrine, like all of these things, that it's not just words coming from Donald Trump anymore. It's now action, and an action that goes against the order that the U.S. and others have built over the past 80 years. And I think, Carney's not some parliamentarian from Western Canada that, has never dealt with foreign policy. This is a guy that ran the Bank of England, the Bank of Canada. Like he knows the world. And, for him to put it in such stark terms and so eloquently, I think means we need to look at that and think about what that means for the long term of not just the international order, where the order might be going in the future, the role the United States has in that, the role the United States and its allies have with each other going forward. I think that's one of these speeches that we could look back at in decades from now and say that was a major hinge point, turning point. I don't want to say Churchill's Iron Curtain speech or Trump's speech Putin's speech at Munich or Munich Security Conference back in 2007. But I think we got to recognize that for what it was and what it could portend. But then also, I think something to keep in mind is the fact that we've seen stuff like this before, right? Like, this isn't the first attempt by some sort of power to sort of circumvent the UN or build some sort of alternative to the UN. And, we've got, China has done this before. The Russians have done this in the post-Soviet world before, but those were regional and haven't really extended beyond a regional framework. The only thing that has been global is the BRICS. But, the BRICS, well, like this amalgamation of countries, has as many things that draw it apart than bring it together. But I think what sets this apart from those past attempts is the fact that the U.S. is involved in it.
I think that's
right?
one
Like
thing.
The U.S.
Private individuals are involved, right? Like all of those groups, representation is premised on sovereignty and being the representative of a sovereign entity. Included on the board here is Tony Blair as Tony Blair, and CEO of Apollo Global Management, Mark Rowan, presumably one of Trump's old Wharton business school buddies. Right? So, I think that's also quite significant. So I think you're wrong. The inclusion of the U.S. in one of these sort of rival, rogue, I don't know, sort of governance alternatives is relatively new. I mean, I would point out that the G7 began as one of these breakaway informal groupings that was meant to basically get past impasses at the IMF, and that was a U.S. initiative under Nixon and then Ford, but the inclusion of private individuals as private individuals, I think, is a really significant change in how we govern international order.
Yeah, and I think it could be in part too sort of the mad dash sort of aspect of this as well too, right? Because when you think back of where this came from, it's all stemming from Gaza, right? So the Tony Blair thing makes sense when you think of it just in the framework of Gaza, right? But now as it gets bigger, it's almost like they saw this and they're like, wonder if we can make this bigger and turn it into our own vehicle for sidestepping the UN or some sort of global legitimacy in some framework to sort of do what we want to in other cases of conflict or intractable situations. And so, it speaks to the nature of, I don't know how much thought was put into this in the long term. But
yeah,
yes,
if I look at logo, I'm thinking about 5 minutes with MS Paint.
Yeah.
For younger listeners,
ChatGPT.
MS Paint used to be something you'd get on a PC, a personal. Anyway, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, young is all relative. Yeah, I mean, I think, like I mentioned before, I think a key aspect to watch for is, does this body actually try to do anything beyond Gaza, right? Does Trump try to bring this in to figure out something in Russia or with the Ukraine war? Does he try to bring it into other areas and do something with it? Or, is it, just this thing that they announced and that's all it's going to be? And I think time will tell. I think what we can watch for is if they do start to use it outside of Gaza, I think that will highlight the fact that, okay, they are actually trying to actualize this thing beyond Gaza and make it into this bigger body. Because right now it stands as another sort of announcement that doesn't really mean anything unless you actually try to use it for something. So at the moment, we're still waiting to see if there is anything, if there's any bite there. Yeah.
Absolutely. How do you feel, or what do you think the UN thinks of this. I mean, just the other week we were talking about the 80th anniversary of the United Nations. This is a big moment of potential renewal. You know, we've got a UN Secretary General election coming up. We are at this moment internationally of historic rupture. And now, exactly as you point out, you know, the UN potentially has a rival here that isn't just, you know, some idea of peripheral countries, but rather is being championed by the most powerful country in the world that, exactly as you note, has recently withdrawn from over 60 of the UN's agencies. Do you think they're seeing this as a credible threat? If you were advising somebody running for the UN Secretary General, what would your advice be?
I mean, I think it would be yes and no. I think, you know, no one yet can still rival the UN's breadth, right? It's, you know, every nation on earth. It has all those bodies are still doing things around the world. You've got the World Food Program, you know, all these different things, human rights issues, humanitarian aid, the things that the UN has done well over the past 80 years. Now, obviously, we all know the downsides to the UN because of its makeup with the Security Council and its inability to really do what it was meant to do because of that. And that's sort of be able to keep the peace in a lot of different places and get people to agree on things. But I think they're probably thinking, you know what, we've faced challenges before. We've had time periods when the US was more involved, less involved. Sort of pushing back against the UN. I'm thinking, you know, back in starting in the late 60s through the 70s when the General Assembly became more powerful than it had before just because of the sheer numbers. And the US started to feel a little bit like, oh, we really don't kind of run this thing anymore. There was a pushback in the US and then the US kind of got back into it. But I think looking at this more long term, I think there has to be a realization that we are not going back to the norm. And, you know, everybody's been talking about the need for reform for years now, but it's become more and more in center to where even the Democratic platform for the Biden administration when they were running in 2020 was recommending and pushing for some sort of Security Council change and reform in the UN. So even the side in the US that usually has been pro-UN and international organizations has been pushing back against the body to some extent. So I think they understand and need to understand that we're in a different world, that even if a Democrat gets elected in 2028, you're not just going to go back to 2016 or 2012 or even 2020, right? And the drastic flip-flop between administrations that we have seen there's nothing out there that's demonstrating that that's going to change anytime soon. You know, so I think there's an acknowledgement of we've dealt with challenges to our authority. We still do a lot that nobody else can replicate yet, but that we're also living in a different world and they need to prepare for that and understand that.
Absolutely, and you know, this speaks to the core point that Prime Minister Carney made at Davos, that we need to accept that this is not a moment of transition. It is one of rupture. The old order is gone, and it is not coming back. So yeah, I agree with you entirely there.
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, what can we move forward with that has worked well and is still working well, and then how can they adapt? And will they be able to adapt? But like I said, I mean, the jury's still out on this Board of Peace and how much power it has, how much funding it has. You know, all those things matter. And, you know, we'll just have to see what happens here. But obviously, you know, what a week, man. Davos was just on the edge of your seat if you are a, you know, foreign policy junkie like we are. So it was something. The most interesting Davos I can remember.
I definitely had a feeling of missing out.
Yeah, it was something else. But All right. Well, I just wanted to flag, not sure what we'll talk about next time, but some of the things that I've been sort of watching that have intrigued me recently, and I just wanted to, we're not going to get into anything in detail, but just kind of flag stuff. The Israelis a couple weeks ago recognized Somaliland, and I know we've talked about Somaliland on the podcast before. So that was a major move, and something we might talk about in the future or in a future episode, because it's important, but it's also just very interesting from a geopolitical, geostrategic aspect. Why Somaliland wants that, why the Israelis want it, and why the international community is pushing back against that. But then also, huge news over the weekend. We're recording this on Tuesday night, January 27th, was the purge of high-level military officials in China, and what that might mean on a whole host of issues. Military readiness. Was he leaking nuclear secrets to the United States? What that means for Xi Jinping's inner circle. So I definitely think that'll be something you'll hear us talk about in coming episodes.
Yeah. And also on China, I mean, something I'm particularly paying attention to right now is last week the Canadian Prime Minister announcing a deal with Beijing that certainly upset the American president, but a big change in Canadian Chinese relations in recent, in the past decade, basically, where there was a real thaw. A real chill in relations for more than reasonable reasons. So that's a big change. What that means for Canada, but also Canada as a power so close, or as a middle power so closely tied to the U.S. and trying to diversify or decouple. And of course, as we speak right now, but certainly by the time this is out, the British Prime Minister is presently on his way to Beijing. The British Prime Minister is on his way to Beijing to meet with Xi for, I believe it's a 3-day visit. And I think this will also give us a lot of information on sort of which way the wind is blowing as countries begin to think or continue to think about revising their dependence upon and the relationship with the United States.
Yeah, and this is all, again, tied to, a lot of the things that happened over the course of the past month, but also the last year, the first administration. And, I view these as the U.S., their own goals, right? Like it's based on our policies, and they're coming back to bite us in the face. And, tied to the Canada-China deal is also the massive EU-India trade deal that was just signed as well, I mean, and they're talking about just how enormous that deal is, and it's not the EU and the US, it's not India and the US, it's the US is left out of this, right? And these are own goals, this is all continued fallout from policies of the past year, stuff that came to the surface at Davos, and I think it's a guide to what we're going to see more of, I think, in the coming months and years.
You're right. Well, we'll be talking about it in a couple of weeks' time.
I'm sure we will. All right, man. Good talking to you as always, and stay warm there in Hong Kong. Yeah. And I will keep digging my driveway out of snow. But anyways, thanks for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy, and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.